the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
And we continue here on location at Mount Vernon. This is History as It Happens, a special series of conversations with the brand new executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library here, historian Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, once again, on behalf of the Washington Times, thank you for having us here.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you so much for coming out.
Part 2, we'll call it, of our conversation is going to be about the book you've been working on all these years, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. I have a copy of it here. Oxford University Press.
Actually in print.
Yeah, I bet you were thrilled when you received this.
I was.
Yes. How long did it take you to write this book? Because, I'm always curious as to the process that historians go through, because you could spend forever working on a book like this. The literature is voluminous, right? Talk a little bit about the kind of book you wanted to write. It weighs in at a very sturdy 400 and something pages. But as I mentioned, you could have written a 1,000-page book about John Adams.
Yes, and lots of the pages at the end are notes. So it's not actually a terribly long read.
No.
So I started thinking seriously about the project in 2020. And it's coming out in September of 2024, September 5th. So it's about 4 years, start to finish. And of course, there are downtimes there for the actual printing. But you're right. I mean, you could research forever. You could continue to try to answer every single question indefinitely. And there are questions I was not able to answer, and they drive me crazy. But I wanted to have it out before the election because I felt very strongly that there was a message about the importance of civic virtue, which I define as putting the Constitution above one's own political or partisan goals. And there's a message about the essentialness of the peaceful transfer of power to our republic. And so I wanted that message to be heard for the election and before the transition.
It was nice while it lasted, wasn't it? That was a political comment by me there. Why John Adams?
Well, it's a great question. So after I finished my first book on George Washington's presidency, I started to think about, okay, so Washington established all these precedents for how to create the presidency, but then he left, and he was such a unusual character in history. His stature was so unprecedented and was so unparalleled and was never repeated again that there were real questions at the time, and I think there were long-term historical questions about, would this institution work for anyone else? Could anyone else actually inhabit it and make it work? So then I started to look at, okay, what happened with the immediate people after him, and what happened with the presidents that immediately followed, and how did they take his cabinet and some other elements of the presidency and make it work or make it not work, or what did they change? So I was initially conceptualizing a book that was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And I started writing it, and I realized I really actually didn't want to write the Thomas Jefferson part, and I dropped that part off. Partly that was because I had already written a scholarly article about Jefferson's cabinet, and I felt like I had really said everything I wanted to say, and anything else would be just like stretching it out for the sake of stretching it out, which I don't think produces the best writing. But I also found myself so drawn into the challenge of coming second, like what it means to come after someone who is the most popular president that we've ever had and will ever have, and to know that you are going to fall short by comparison. John Adams knew exactly what he was walking into, and he did it anyway. And I found that to be a very interesting question. And then January 6th happened, and I realized how much I was taking for granted the peaceful transfer of power and the elements of our political system, the norms and precedents that serve as a scaffolding for our institutions, but they're not written down, how fragile they are, how precious they were, and how carefully they had to be constructed. And as I was going back and looking at other biographies of John Adams, of which there are many phenomenal ones, I realized that they gave very little attention to the presidency. And I think the reason they did so is because they were not looking at it in that same way. They had not just lived through a violent transition. And so it's easy to miss the very small things that Adams did and that happened in his presidency to make sure the presidency survived.
Because as you say, we think of George Washington as the person who set all the important precedents. But the man who came after him, you're arguing in your book, this is your thesis, that he had a huge influence on the presidency that affected his immediate successors, and even until today, would you say?
I would. I mean, there were so many things that Washington did that he wasn't challenged on because it was Washington, and so many powers that he kind of just assumed that could have easily gone by the wayside, or precedents that could have easily been one-offs or interesting historical anomalies that were contained in footnotes in history books. And so I think it's really John Adams who figures out what the institution looks like for mere mortals and figures out what powers actually do belong to the presidency and what is actually going to be respected by other institutions, and how are we going to actually make this work. And that is a much messier picture than sometimes Washington had to experience. But it's also, I think, much more relatable to our contemporary moment when we do not revere our presidents like people revered Washington.
And in our current moment, hyper-partisanship, hyper-polarization is corrosive. Adams hated that stuff, but it was hard for him to totally avoid it. I mean, his own cabinet was caught up in this.
Yeah, so one of the parallels between the 1790s and today that I think is so important and so relevant is this intense partisanship. And I actually attribute it to really weak parties, because both parties were on the weaker side at the time, although the Federalists were certainly weaker than the Democratic Republicans. And as a result, they were not able to protect a diversity of perspectives. They were not able to protect moderate positions or opinions, to allow people to make different choices. And so they turned inward on each other and often saved their most virulent rhetoric for what they deemed to be like squishy or soft Federalists. And we see that in our own lived experience today, that we don't have parties that can always protect that type of diversity of perspective, and instead have all of this infighting, which leads to this increasing animosity and real nastiness in the political system. And so I think that if, Adams were to be alive today, there are things like the recording equipment that we are using that would blow his mind, but some of our political world would feel very relatable.
People may look back on Adams' presidency because it was only one term and consider him a failure. Also, he was the last Federalist president. The Alien and Sedition Acts that we will get to, they were pretty bad. Ink was still drying on the First Amendment, and Republican or Democratic Republican editors and publishers are being tossed into prison for criticizing the federal government. By the way, before I continue with this question, you used the term Democratic Republican. I see sometimes people just calling it the Republican Party. What's your take on that?
In the book, I call them the Republican Party because that's what they call themselves. But often when I'm talking on a conversation like this one, I use Democratic Republican because if people on the off chance only hear part of it, I don't want them to think that I'm talking about the Republican Party either of Lincoln or of today. And so when I'm writing, I often will use Republican because I can count that people will, count on people seeing that explanation. But sometimes on a conversation like this one, I'll use the full term as they're known in history just for clarity.
And there were the Democratic Republican societies.
Yes.
That were pretty critical of George Washington. He did not appreciate what they were saying about him.
No, he did not.
And as we were discussing in part one of our conversation, you're already seeing two different philosophies or groupings of people with diametrically opposed views on how the country should be governed and the meaning of the American Revolution and all that. But I was saying about Adams, people looking back on his presidency, looking at it as a failure. Do you believe his presidency was a failure because it was just a one term?
I don't. I think it's actually really a mistake to say that a presidency is a failed presidency just because it's one term. Because as we know from contemporary politics, election outcomes often have actually very little to do with what a president has actually done. It can have everything to do with how the economy is. What's the price of oil, which the president has some control over, but has no control over what Saudi Arabia is doing. Yeah. What was the previous administration? Americans tend to not like to elect one party to the presidency more than 3 terms. So, for example, George H.W. Bush came after Reagan, and by then I think people were a little tired of the same party, and so they wanted change. But I think George H.W. Bush was a phenomenal president and had huge critical foreign policy successes and should not be deemed a failure. So that is an example that I like to use to sort of push back against that idea.
Well, I think Herbert Hoover would agree with you about, things out of your control ruining the party. Although, even there, it's how you respond to the unforeseen event. 100%. So we can get into Adams' presidency right now and into the meat of your book. He's greeted with a crisis right from the get-go, right? So a potential war with France. What is going on there, and how does Adams initially respond to this threat?
One of the interesting things about the late 1790s is, like when you build a house or when you do a remodel and you put in new appliances or a new roof, and right when you start to hit the 10, 15 year mark is when things start to need a lot of improvements or upgrades or things start to break down. And the nation was sort of at that point as well. A lot of its treaties had been signed for 15-ish years or a little bit longer. And its place on the world stage was kind of at a point where it needed some refresh. It needed some updates. And that was very much true in its position vis-a-vis Great Britain and France. So the United States had signed a treaty with Great Britain in 1794 called the Jay Treaty. France really didn't like it, and in response had started retaliating by seizing American ships that were going back and forth trading goods with both France and with Great Britain. And when they seized these ships, they took the goods, they took the ships, but they also usually jailed the sailors. And so obviously this was going to be very unpopular behavior in the United States. Adams had initially they had an envoy who had gone to France to try and resolve this, to come up with a new treaty, as diplomacy typically worked at the time, and he was expelled from France, which was not a declaration of war, but it was certainly tiptoeing in that direction. So one of the first things that John Adams did was to send a 3-person commission, John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, to France to try and resolve some of these issues, to come up with a new treaty that would kind of put their relationship on a fresh page and to address some of their grievances. And this treaty was met with a series of unofficial envoys, which they called Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z.
You mean the commission was met by?
Yes, the commission was met by these unofficial envoys. Yeah. There was actually also an Agent W, but it doesn't really roll off the tongue.
Yeah, the XYZ affair. It wouldn't be the same, but go ahead.
So it was met by these unofficial envoys who demanded bribes and loans and apologies for things the president had said, which were all very insulting demands, really insulting to American honor, American independence, and American sovereignty. And when word got back to the United States of these demands, it became known as the XYZ affair for Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. While the United States did not immediately declare war, Adams did have to kind of figure out, how do you deal with this quasi-war situation? And it was in fact called the quasi-war with France.
Because the United States doesn't really have much of a navy at this point. The idea of going to war with a major power, a major Atlantic power, is probably crazy to some people. But there were people in the Federalist Party, right, who thought there should be a war. I don't know if they were called high Federalists, but there was a lot of infighting in his party. So he's facing some just structural difficulties, right?
Yeah, he is. So Adams he had been begging for a navy for basically decades, because as a good, New Englander, he understood the value of trade and ships and merchants and all those things, and understood that both American trade would flourish if it had a navy to protect it, but also diplomacy would work better if you both had the carrot and stick to use in diplomacy. So Congress finally gave him his navy and gave him a naval department to oversee it, which he was very excited about. Congress rapidly expanded the army, which he was a little bit less excited about. To your point, France was at that time the biggest army in the world, and Napoleon was coming onto the scene. So even though France was distracted with its war with Great Britain, it's still not a risk you necessarily want to take, to be engaging the largest army in warfare. And then Congress also passed a number of other defensive measures, like boosting coastal defenses, and passed a number of pieces of legislation, which I know we will talk about, including the Alien and Sedition Acts. And there was a conflict within Congress because the Federalists were divided between, they're called sometimes the High Federalists or the Arch Federalists, and then the more moderate faction. And then there were the Republicans. And Republicans believed in some of the defensive measures, but they felt like everything with France had really been a misunderstanding. And if they could just try diplomacy again, it would go better. Whereas the Federalists kind of felt like, we kind of already tried that. Maybe we should try defending ourselves and see what happens there.
And some of the Federalists believe that the Republicans under Jefferson were pro-French nuts, right? Fanatics.
Yeah, I mean, and so there was a belief among the Federalists that not only were the Republicans sympathetic to France, but that they actively wanted to work with France to destroy the Republic. This is where the Democratic Republican societies come in. They were fairly radical civil groups, but there were also things like armed militias. They were called the Greens. It was a group of Irish militiamen that had been put together by one of the Republican newspaper editors and were actually armed. And so there was this fear that if France did invade, that these militia groups and the Democratic Republican societies combined with the Republicans would side with France. And some of those fears were not totally far off and some were very misplaced. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson, while he was vice president, met with the French minister and said, you don't really need to worry about diplomacy with Adams. Why don't you just not do anything? And when I come into power in a couple of years, I'll give you a better deal. Not great for a vice president to be doing that.
That's well, in those days, whoever was second became the vice president, exactly. And Jefferson is running opposition out of the vice president's office.
Basically, yes. So it wasn't technically treason because war wasn't declared with France, but he was definitely flirting with it.
I want to get to the actual election that put Adams into power. I bounced around on the chronology here a little bit, but about Adams' cabinet first. He had a lot of people who were with Washington. Mm-hmm. He didn't choose his own cabinet, it seems, and they were against him.
Yeah. So this is one of those things where it's so important we don't read history backwards. So when Adams came into power, there were these real concerns that the presidency might not work if Washington wasn't in it. And the American people had never lived through a transition like this. They were very nervous about it. In the context, the global context, the most recent transition they had seen was the French Revolution. While they weren't necessarily expecting it to devolve into guillotines and blood running through the streets, you never really expect that. You never know when the Constitution is really going to fail. And so the American people were so nervous in early 1797 that this Constitution, which was already the nation's second chance, was going to fall apart. And Adams came into this situation and he said he had never sat in on a cabinet meeting, so he didn't really know how that dynamic worked.
As vice president.
Correct.
Yeah, he hated that office, didn't he?
Totally. He thought it was completely useless. Washington had never included him in those conversations, and so he didn't know what that looked like. He knew the secretaries a little bit, but not all that well, but felt like they would be loyal to the office. He felt like retaining them would be providing good institutional longevity and institutional knowledge and provide some sort of continuity. There was no model of replacing them, so now we know that that's something that you have to do, but he didn't know that. And critically, Washington didn't tell him that some of the secretaries were terrible. Some of them were bad at their jobs and were very ill-suited to those positions.
Because Washington had already been on his second cabinet, basically, because Jefferson had left office and Hamilton had left. So Washington had lost his great first cabinet. Most of them had retired or resigned or gone home. These positions were not particularly fancy or well paid at the time. They were not all that prestigious. It was very hard to find replacements. And so Washington had really had to settle for some people who he didn't really want. Timothy Pickering, who became his Secretary of State, was his sixth choice. Wow.
Pickering also knew he was his sixth choice, so that probably wasn't great for cabinet relations. And he was a smart man, but he was not well suited to diplomacy. And Washington knew it and didn't tell Adams. So Adams decided to keep this cabinet. He trusted Washington to tell him if he shouldn't. Washington didn't say anything. Adams kept this cabinet. Now, Charles Lee, who was the attorney general, was actually a really good attorney general and was pretty independently minded and was loyal to Adams. Adams got to appoint his naval secretary, who he loved. Benjamin Stoddert was the first secretary of the Navy. But the other three were not great. At times were downright insubordinate or disloyal and worked actively to undermine Adams' administration and his re-election campaign.
Well, I think it worked because he did not win re-election. About 1796, you were talking about concerns on the part of Americans about what comes next. If you had to look at the Constitution to figure out, all right, so how do we hold a competitive national presidential election? The Constitution is not really all that helpful. There was direct balloting in some states. Other states, you elected a slate of electors via the state legislatures, right? So talk a little bit about that dynamic. And how does Adams, who seemed to have so many problems right from the start with his own party, how did he become the heir apparent to Washington?
Yeah, the election process was extremely messy. And as I describe it, if it sounds messy, that's okay because that's what they thought about it too. As you said, the Constitution actually says very little about how elections are supposed to work in practice, other than each elector was to cast 2 votes, and one needed to be for someone outside of their own state. And the idea was that you would pick the 2 best candidates and that they would become the president and vice president. And of course, this system was designed before the emergence of political parties. What made it messy, as you said, was that each state, and this is true to today, has the right under the Constitution to decide how electors will be chosen. So some had direct elections, some had balloting processes, others had the state legislatures were able to select their electors. And so what you actually had was basically from summer up through December 3rd, you had a series of different elections for the state legislatures, the electors, sometimes for the direct balloting. And it was like a wave of overlapping elections that was clear that as they sort of folded on top of each other, how these decisions would be made. And they did this all without type of polling we have today, without the internet, without the telephone. And so, for example, in 1796, they started casting votes in early October. The Electoral College had cast its votes in early December. Adams did not have the certainty that he had won until December 31st. So he basically lived through 3 months of not really knowing. And he still didn't really know for sure until February 11th when he opened the votes in Congress to certify the results.
Wow. And it was very, very close.
It was extremely close. He won by 3 votes.
This is a tough question to answer because it's a very modern question. Do we know what issues swung the election either way?
We do in 1800. 1796 is a little bit harder to tell because they were really still figuring out. It was the first national competitive election. And so Adams stayed home, he stayed out of it. Jefferson stayed home, he stayed out of it, per what was considered to be the appropriate custom for campaigning at the time. It kind of came down to like Adams was sort of Washington's heir apparent because he was vice president and closest in terms of the constitutional positioning. And there was an expectation that he would probably continue a lot of Washington's policies, namely neutrality, not getting into war with France or Great Britain, but having, maybe a strong-ish federal government, some investment in what we would think of as 18th century infrastructure, things like that. The Federalists generally preferred a slightly stronger federal government. Yeah. The Democratic Republicans, with Jefferson at the helm, they tended to be a little bit more pro-French in their foreign policy, although they didn't really want war either. So neither side was particularly gung-ho in 1796 to get to war. They distrusted a strong federal government. They generally preferred investment in agriculture as opposed to cities and that kind of thing. But it was much fuzzier, and the accusations were that, Jefferson was an atheist and John Adams wanted to bring in a monarchy, and neither of those things were true.
Adams was considered an aristocrat, a certain kind of American aristocrat.
Which would have made him laugh if he could have shown them his bank accounts, because he was not wealthy.
His background, too, right? His dad was a farmer.
Very humble.
But the Federalist ideology, if you will, did have that elitist bent.
Yes.
Governed by your betters. Politics of deference. So my next question to you was going to be, what was Adams' philosophy? Because we look back on him, and as you said, he's so overshadowed by George Washington. It just seems like he's Washington's third term because he was a Federalist. But the parties were fledgling in those days. So what was Adams' philosophy? Because he certainly had his own philosophy about government.
He did. In a lot of ways, it was actually quite similar to Washington's. He came about it independently. So he had served, one of his great strengths was that he had served as a diplomat in France and the Netherlands and London. And so he had seen firsthand both the importance of American trade to America's future, the essentialness of engaging with other nations. He was not an isolationist, but also he understood that foreign nations didn't care what happened to the United States. They were not altruistic when they were thinking about their own foreign policy. They were out for their own good. They were very self-interested. And so he had a very rational perspective on what foreign policy should be and the essentialness of neutrality to ensuring the country's strength, which was exactly what Washington thought. They just got there on their own. He certainly believed in trade. He believed in the Navy. He believed in, cities as places of commerce and education. So in a lot of ways, he and Washington really did share a lot of their ideas because neither were actually the super ardent Federalists who wanted the strong standing Navy to be used for political reasons.
And Adams had this idea or theory about mixed government.
Yeah, he did. So his idea about government was in a lot of ways informed by his study of the British system. So when we think of our system, we typically refer to a system of separation of powers, which is actually not a very accurate description, because if we think about like the power to wage war, Congress actually declares it. The president is the commander in chief. So they're kind of sharing that power. But we called it the separation of powers because we were thinking of a system of like vetoes and checks on the other branches. Whereas the British system is referred to as this mixed system. It's a shared system where the branches are supposed to work together on these various things as opposed to checking one another. So it's basically like a positive interpretation as opposed to a negative veto interpretation. And he was very deeply read about international constitutions, the study of history. In his diary, the first couple of months of his presidency that he did keep it, he would talk about what he was planting in the summer. And he would talk about carrots and corn and peas and the type of worms that were on his corn. And then he would talk about reading Cicero at night. So he was very deeply read.
Along those lines, government of the many or government of the few? The new regime that was emerging, I mentioned before how Adams was the last Federalist president, lowercase d democracy. Adams was not a lowercase d Democrat. And I think this is why I view Adams as somebody who was, well, his way of doing things didn't become extinct. There were still Federalists in Congress, and I don't want to overstate the lowercase d democratic ideas of the Jeffersonians because they still had a top-down politics of deference too, maybe not like the Federalists. But I guess my question is, well, was he a lowercase d Democrat? I don't think he ever really embraced democracy, did he?
No, none of them really did. Not in the way that we would think of lowercase d democracy today. So they were distrustful of, and when I say they, I mean
the elites.
Kind of all of them. I mean, even people like Madison and Jefferson, they trusted the American people a little bit more, but not really. They wanted there to be certain requirements for education and certain requirements for property and voting and things like that, because they didn't trust that the American people, when they got together in a huge group, wouldn't succumb to mob rule. And that was really Adams' concern. And so when they think about an aristocracy, he was really actually talking about what we would kind of think of almost as like a meritocracy, is you did want to have people that were governing, they should be the best people. And that was not defined by blood or by birth line, like in places like Britain, but instead by education and success and abilities.
An American aristocracy.
Yes.
Which wasn't really an aristocracy, not like
No.
the Europeans. Okay. Your interpretation of Adams' his presidency is generally positive, but you don't shy away from the negatives. And I'm saying this in the context of the many crises he had to deal with. Timing was not on his side. I often say timing is everything in politics. He picked a rough time to be president. This Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798. These were not his ideas, right? But he went along with them. Why?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's worth splitting up into what they are briefly, just because I think that
it's two different pieces of legislation.
So it's actually 4.
Oh, wow.
So there's the Naturalization
That's why I
Act.
have you here, Lindsay. Correct my mistakes. Go ahead.
So there's the Naturalization Act, which made it much harder to become a citizen. And that was because immigrants tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans. There was the Alien Enemy Act, which said that if the country was at war, that foreign nationals could be deported with the normal course of justice, of sort of due process. And that was actually a bill that was put forth by the Republicans to try and stave off more radical measures by the Federalists. And we've actually had a version of that type of bill on the books ever since. Whenever we've been in periods of war, it's been invoked. The Alien Friends Act, however, was then passed by the Federalists, was much more radical. And it basically said that the president could remove any foreign national at will. Now, that bill, while John Adams did sign it, he never actually invoked it. So he didn't actually deport anyone. And so while it was quite malicious in its intent, I kind of do set it to the side because he never actually used it. And he would have been the one that would have invoked it. The last one is the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act, again, as you said, he didn't ask for these bills. He didn't whip them. He didn't count noses or votes, but he did sign them. And when Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State, brought forth prosecutions, he did approve of them. One bit of context that's worth noting is at the time, the First Amendment was quite new. There wasn't the same sort of jurisprudence that we have that says things like, you don't have the right to speech that invokes violence. And newspaper editors at the time were printing speech that was encouraging and calling for violence.
Oh, the attacks were scurrilous.
They were horrible. And violence was happening in the streets. Newspaper editors were beaten up. There were threats that were being delivered to the president's house. There was no Secret Service, no gate. outside. And so there were genuine fears of political violence, but the Federalists used those genuine fears to then produce a very political bill. What they feared was understandable, but then they convinced themselves that any means were appropriate to address those fears, including crushing basically the opposition party. And so the sedition bill protected Congress and it protected the president, but it notably left off the vice president from criticism. While it did include things like truth as a defense, it's very difficult to prove a political opinion.
Yeah, what's true or false in politics.
Exactly.
The idea of ordinary people viciously attacking their betters, this is novel. I mean, George Washington did not like this. I don't know if the attacks against Washington by the societies were as vicious and personal as they were targeted at Adams later on. We weren't a monarchy, but this is still new.
There were many attacks against Washington, and he hated them. He had a very thin skin. He did not like the attacks. I think the difference was the level of public violence that appeared to be increasing in the Adams administration was markedly different than in the Washington administration. So it seemed like there was a correlation between the political discourse and the violence people were seeing in the streets.
Was this whipped up because of the war hysteria with France, or what?
It was partly the war hysteria. It was partly the partisan animosity. It was partly editors on both sides talking about how the other was going to destroy the republic. And so there was this fear that the other was a fatal threat to the future of the nation.
And we're, a decade into our existence, and
Exactly.
everything is about to fall to pieces.
100%.
Right? I recall something I read in one of Gordon Wood's books, Empire of Liberty, where people would cross the street so they wouldn't have to pass by someone who had different politics. That's kind of like today. You don't want to sit at the Thanksgiving table with your obnoxious uncle who watches too much cable news. So I think we all look back today as the Alien and Sedition Acts as a disgrace, as a big mistake. These were repealed eventually by the next administration, right?
Well, they expired on the last day of Adams' presidency, which was another. But interestingly, there was actually another Sedition Act that was put in place during the Jefferson administration, and he did enforce it. So that part does not always get told.
Wow, I did not know that. That's amazing. So in sum here, what is Adams' most, or you don't have to give me one, but maybe things that people overlook, his most important or enduring legacies? Because when I try to judge presidencies, and not that anyone's listening to me, I try to look at things that endure. So Franklin Roosevelt, there's a lot of blemishes on his record, but what endured? The Social Security Act, right? The Wagner Labor Relations Act, pieces of the legislation that fundamentally altered the relationship between the citizens and their government. Where does Adams come in that category?
So I think he did three things that are worth remembering. First, he showed up. It was going to be an impossible position to follow Washington. He knew it. He did it anyway. It required a certain amount of political obstinacy or political courage to take on that task and know that he was probably not going to be popular. And so I think that deserves applause. The second is he really defended certain executive authorities and executive powers, including the right to determine diplomacy and foreign policy, the right to remove secretaries if he didn't like working with them. That was an untested concept because Washington had never had to do so. And the cabinet was really looking to create more of a shared authority arrangement, not unlike the British cabinet today. And he rejected that, and he fought back against that threat, which really defined what the presidency was going to be like for the people that followed.
Yeah, because think about that, right? We just take it for granted today that the cabinet secretaries are.
Absolutely.
Like you said.
Absolutely.
And number three.
Number three is the peaceful transfer of power. So he was instrumental in ensuring how once the election of 1800, which I know you covered recently, was actually decided, he did a number of important things to ensure that Jefferson had all the information he needed. He instructed his secretaries to work cooperatively with Jefferson. He had Jefferson over to the White House. He did not participate in any of the schemes that the Federalists were cooking up to try and throw the election. And also, he lost and he went home. He went home quietly.
And some people hold it against him that he didn't go to the inauguration.
So that precedent was not established until 1845.
There you go.
And he was not invited to the inauguration, and the election had been so near violent and such a near miss that I think he genuinely worried that his presence would be a distraction, would make it into a circus, and would detract from Jefferson's ability to turn the page. It's essential that we remember that this is the age of Napoleon, when people lost and did not go home. They came back from Elba and had another 100 days on the throne. And instead he lost and he went home, and that is a radical act.
Well, it is something listening to you about how Adams did have a brilliant mind. Yet, maybe in the minds of some people, he's not on the same level as the Jeffersons and the Madisons when it comes to constitutional theory, government, leadership. But he certainly belongs on the same plane as all of those other men.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was just as deeply read on constitutions as Madison. He was extraordinarily well-traveled. He was very thoughtful. He suffers from being stuck between Washington and Jefferson for, posterity's sake. And he suffers from living at the same time of two of the greatest propagandists in American history, which were Hamilton and Jefferson. And both were writing slanderous garbage about him. And yet sometimes historians take it at face value. And I think that's a mistake.
Well, you really get into that in the book. The way Hamilton, man, what a schemer.
Yes.
Well, party was a new thing. It wasn't as important as it might be today. You just don't see that type of we're speaking here. People are going to listen to this podcast, weeks or months after we're done recording it. We happen to be speaking now as the DNC and it's going on in Chicago. You're not going to see that type of dissension out in the open or anything like that. Unity is the word. So last thing, and we'll wrap up here. Book is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Your book tour. I read about this in your newsletter. Oh my goodness. You're going to be everywhere for the next however many months, all the way into next spring.
Yes.
Amazing.
It's going to be a very busy year. Very excited about it. I will be all over the place. People can find the full book tour at my website, which is lindsaychervinsky.com. I will be speaking here at Mount Vernon on September 12th, and my first event will be September 8th at Politics and Prose with Peter Baker.
And you also have something with Smithsonian Associates.
Smithsonian Associates, something with the National Archives. I will be in Boston and Philadelphia and Dallas and California, and so lots of great places.
Sounds exhausting, but really exciting. I mean, these are major institutions. You may have mentioned this Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. That's in New York City, right?
Yes, although that will be a virtual event.
Virtual event. I love the New York Historical Society, by the way. And you'll be at the SMU Center for Presidential History with Jeffrey Engel.
I will.
Will he be doing the panel, or was somebody else?
Yes. I will be talking with Jeff. Jeff was my former boss, so I'm really looking forward to that conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindsay Chervinsky, for having us here for this special series of episodes of History as It Happens on location at Mount Vernon. New episodes of the podcast every Tuesday and Thursday. You can sign up for my newsletter, which comes out every Friday at historyasithappens.com, or you can find History as It Happens on Substack.
Picture this. You're not just fixing cars, you're living your passion every day. At Cox, you'll work on a diverse range of automobiles. Surrounded by a team of friendly, like-minded individuals, you'll enjoy great pay and benefits. Ready to make this a reality? At Cox, we're recruiting auto and diesel techs to join our Mannheim and Fleet Services teams. Learn, grow, and fine-tune your career as a technician at Cox. Find out more at cox.career/autotech.